Wyoming Territory, 1874. Rain hammered the roof of the old feed barn, drowning out the sound of the woman's sobs until the baby cried too. Rowena Nells pressed her trembling hand to her infant's chest, feeling the frail rise and fall. His breathing was shallow again. She rocked him harder, ignoring the pain in her back, her worn dress soaked through from the storm. I know, sweetheart. Just breathe for me," she whispered, tears sliding down her face. The baby, named Silas, was only 3 months old, yet he had already nearly died twice. The doctor in Rawlins had called it weak lungs and said not to hope too high. And now, with no home, no husband, and no place to go, Rowena was trying to keep him warm inside a half-empty barn behind the general store. She had nowhere else left. Earlier that morning, she had stood in her husband's family's parlor, holding Silas close, her voice shaking as she pleaded with them. "He is your grandson. He is sick, but he's fighting." Please, her mother-in-law, stiff-necked and sharp-eyed, had only folded her arms. "My son is dead. That baby should have died with him." The words still rang in Rowena's ears. She had turned and walked out, shoes soaked through from the snowmelt, clutching her son to her chest. They had shut the door behind her. No one followed. The baby whimpered again. Rowena pressed her lips to his forehead. He was burning up. The barn doors swung open suddenly. Wind and rain rushed in around the tall figure standing in the opening. He was soaked through, a wide-brimmed hat dripping water down his neck, but his eyes were sharp and steady. His coat was rough denim, stitched at the shoulders, and his boots were caked with mud so thick it looked like he had ridden through a storm himself. He stepped in slowly. "You all right in here?" His voice was low, calm. Rowena's arms tightened around Silas. "We will be." He looked at her again, then at the baby. "He sounds bad. He just needs rest. He always gets better after he sleeps." The man crouched a few feet away, giving her space. "That your boy?" She nodded. The man took off his hat, let it hang from his fingers. "Name's Sutton Vale. I got a wagon of feed to deliver in the morning, but I could not rest knowing someone was out here crying in a storm." Rowena blinked at him. "You heard me, ma'am." The whole street could. Her cheeks flushed. She turned her face toward Silas. Sutton's gaze stayed on her. "You got family nearby?" "I did. They shut the door on us this morning." He looked at the baby again. "He got a name?" "Silas." Sutton shifted one knee to the ground now. "He is burnin' up. I know a woman down in Medicine Bow who deals in herbs. She helped my older brother once, when he nearly died of fever. I can ride out come first light." Rowena stared at him. "Why would you help us?" He met her eyes then. "Because he is a baby, and you are out here alone." She shook her head, her voice cracking. "People do not help for nothing." "Well, I ain't people." He stood, stepped back. "You can come stay in my cabin for the night. I got a stove, dry blankets, and a roof that does not leak." Rowena looked down at Silas. His lips were tinged blue. She stood slowly, legs aching, and held her son close. "You could be lying." "I could," Sutton said. "But I am not." She hesitated 1 second longer, then nodded. "All right." They walked through the rain to his wagon. He helped her up carefully, then placed his hat over her lap to shield the baby. The wind howled through the trees as they rode up through the hills. The cabin was small but solid. Sutton had a fire going in minutes, and Rowena sat near it, rubbing Silas's back as his breathing evened out a little. Sutton brought her a blanket. She wrapped it around her shoulders. "Thank you," she said softly, eyes on the fire. He nodded. "You can sleep in the bed. I will take the floor." "I cannot take your bed. It is not a favor. It is the right thing." She looked at him. He was not a handsome man in the polished way her husband had been, but there was a steadiness in him, a quiet strength. She said nothing more. That night, Rowena did not sleep much. Silas stirred often, his lungs rattling. But each time, Sutton was there, bringing water, stoking the fire, handing her clean cloths. She did not ask, and he did not explain. He just did. By morning, the storm had passed. Sutton saddled his horse before dawn and rode out to Medicine Bow. He returned before midday with a pouch of herbs and a note from the healer. Rowena brewed the tea like the note said, then dipped a cloth in it and let Silas breathe it in. By nightfall, the baby's color was better. 2 days later, he smiled for the first time in a week. Rowena's eyes filled with tears. Sutton was chopping wood outside when she opened the door. He smiled, she said, holding Silas up like proof. Sutton just looked at them. Then he set the axe down, walked to them, and brushed his knuckles gently against the baby's cheek. "Well, look at that," he murmured. "Little fighter." Rowena watched him. Her heart beat heavy in her chest. That night, as she tucked Silas into a corner crib Sutton had carved from spare wood, she looked across the room at him. "Why have you not asked me to leave?" He glanced over. "You are not ready. And when I am?" He stood slowly, walked over, and looked down at the baby. "Then you can stay anyway, if you want." Rowena's breath caught. "Why?" He looked at her then, and there was no confusion in his voice. "Because I see him, and I see a boy who needs someone to fight for him. And I see you, and I wonder how anyone could walk away." She swallowed hard. "He is not your blood." Sutton bent, kissed the baby's forehead. "He is my son now." Rowena stared at him, heart pounding. Sutton looked up. "If you will let me be." Tears spilled down her cheeks. She nodded, too choked to speak. He reached out, took her hand gently, and held it there. Neither of them said a word. But something old and broken inside Rowena began to mend. The wind had quieted by the third morning, leaving behind the hush of melting snow and the smell of thawed earth. Sutton's boots creaked across the packed dirt outside as he hauled water from the stream, steam curling from the pail in the cold. Inside, Rowena sat near the stove with a length of thread in her fingers and a small pair of trousers laid across her lap. The stitching at the hem had come loose, and she worked it back together slowly, her eyes on the needle but her thoughts elsewhere. Silas lay swaddled in a padded basket Sutton had lined with wool and birch bark. He slept deeper now, with the color returned to his cheeks and the rasp gone from his breath. Rowena paused her sewing. "You didn't have to fix the floorboards near the hearth," she said as Sutton stepped back in, brushing snow from his sleeves. He set the bucket down gently. "They were soft. I don't like soft things underfoot." She watched him move shoulders solid beneath his shirt, hair damp against his neck. There was something deliberate in how he did everything, as though he believed there was a right way even when no one was watching. She threaded the needle again. "You build things like someone who's lost them before." He knelt by the stove, stirring the coals. "I grew up in a dugout. Walls caved in every spring. You start to understand the value of things that hold." Rowena folded the trousers across her lap. "Where is your family now?" "Scattered. One brother in Colorado, another buried outside Laramie. My ma passed when I was 17. My pa before her, in a mine shaft." She let a silence settle. Then, "You never married?" He glanced at her. "Once. Briefly." Her hands stilled. "What happened?" "She wanted the town life. I didn't." She nodded slowly, then offered the trousers across the room. "These are too short now. I could cut them into patches, if you've shirts that need mending." He took them with a quiet thanks and set them aside. "I've got one that catches wind through the shoulder. Might be a use for them yet." They didn't speak for some time. The only sound came from the low crackling of the fire and Silas's steady breathing. Later, as the day warmed, Sutton led her out behind the cabin where the sun was soft on the snow. A single line of fence ran along the ridge, notched posts with wire stretched between them. "It's not much," he said, thumb tucked into his belt. "But I've got plans to run it farther east. There's grazing land up that way." Rowena shifted Silas in her arms, his small head resting beneath her chin. "You plan to keep cattle?" "Eventually. For now, I got 2 mules and a stubborn milk cow." She glanced at the fence. "You built all this alone?" He nodded once. "Took time, patience. Same way I figure most things." Rowena turned toward the trees. "You don't ask questions much. I reckon folks say what they need when they're ready." She looked at him carefully. "What if they don't know what they need?" He met her gaze. "Then I wait." That night, she stood at the wash basin while Sutton finished securing the shutters. The wind had picked up again, though gentler than before. She dipped the cloth in warm water, wiping down Silas's arms and cheeks. His eyes fluttered open once, then closed again. Sutton stepped beside her, drying his hands on a strip of linen. "He's filling out." Rowena smiled faintly. "He's still small. Strong, though. I can see it in him." She folded the cloth and set it aside. Her voice was quiet. "He wasn't wanted by the ones who should have cared." Sutton leaned against the counter. "That doesn't mean he won't be wanted now." Her fingers brushed her son's forehead. "How do you know what kind of man you'll be with a child that isn't yours by blood?" He didn't answer right away. Then, "Blood's only one kind of bond. Sometimes the ones you choose are stronger than the ones you're born into." Rowena studied him. "You don't speak much, but when you do, it sticks." He shrugged, almost sheepish. "You live alone long enough, you learn to waste fewer words." She dried her hands slowly. "I'd like to help with the cooking tomorrow. I can make biscuit if you flour." "I do," he said. "And lard. Might be a jar of apple preserves tucked back somewhere." She gave a soft nod. "It's been a while since I cooked for someone who didn't expect it." "I don't expect it," he said gently. "But I'd be glad for it." Rowena looked back at Silas, sleeping in the corner cradle. She could hear Sutton sorting through the tin shelves behind her, the quiet clink of glass and metal. She felt something shift inside her, not sudden, not loud, but real. Something was growing here, slow and certain as spring thaw. She did not say it aloud, but she felt it in her bones. This was the first time in months she had wanted to stay. The next morning, frost clung to the windows in feathered lines, but inside the cabin, the stove had already been stoked. Rowena woke to the faint scent of pine smoke and the low sound of Sutton moving about the front room. She eased out from under the quilt and crossed to Silas's cradle. His breathing was steady, his fists curled near his chest. She pressed her lips to his forehead, cool, at last. Sutton glanced over from the table, where he was shaving curls from a block of soap with his pocket knife. "Mornin'. I set water to heat." Rowena nodded, brushing her hair back from her face. "I'll wash up and start the biscuit." "You've got time. Sky's still too gray for the sun to mean it." She filled the basin, her fingers dipping into the warmth with a quiet sigh. Everything about this cabin moved slowly, purposefully. She liked that. It made the day feel like it belonged to her again. By the time the biscuits were in the Dutch oven and the coffee was steeping in the tin pot, Silas had woken and was fussing. Sutton took him with a practiced ease that surprised her, bouncing him gently as he breathed in the scent of breakfast. "He's heavier," Sutton said, adjusting his hold. Rowena poured the first cup of coffee. "He's eating more now. I think the worst has passed." They ate quietly, the warmth between them more than just the heat from the stove. Afterward, Sutton carried a hammer and a spool of wire out to the fence line, and Rowena brought Silas outside, wrapping him in thick wool. The snow had melted to damp clumps, revealing the muddy earth beneath, and the sky was pale with the promise of sun. She sat on the porch rail, Silas tucked close, and watched Sutton work. His movements were sure, his focus unbroken. She admired the way he checked each post for lean and tension, how he didn't rush even when the wind picked up. "You were raised out here?" she asked when he paused nearby, wiping his brow with his sleeve. He leaned against the porch post. "Born north of here, near Hannah. We moved around some. Always ended up where the land was rough and the neighbors scarce." Rowena adjusted Silas's cap. "You ever think of leaving Wyoming?" "I tried once. Went to Kansas with a friend who said he had a plan. Turned out the plan was mostly talk. I came back the same spring." She smiled faintly. "I always wondered what it'd be like to live where the land's green year-round." Sutton nodded toward the distant hills. "I figure if the land makes you work for it, you end up loving it more." She looked out at the wide spread of sky, the distant outline of cottonwoods still bare. "I think that's true of people too." His eyes met hers, quiet and steady. "I reckon it is." That night, after Silas had fallen asleep again, Rowena sat by the hearth, her hands idle for the first time in days. Sutton was carving a handle for a drawknife, smoothing the wood with a piece of worn leather. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It had weight like something being built. She looked over. "What made you bring us in that night?" He kept his eyes on the wood. "You looked like someone who'd stopped expecting kindness." "I didn't like that." She folded her hands in her lap. "Most men would have walked past. I ain't most men." "No, you're not." He set the handle aside, brushing the shavings from his trousers. "You ever think about what you'll do come spring?" She drew in a breath. "I don't know yet. I suppose I'd have to find work. Maybe washing or mending, if someone'll have me." "You could stay." Her heart beat once, hard. "You mean?" "Through spring. I mean through whatever comes. I've got room. And I don't want to see you go." She studied him, her voice low. "You don't know me, Sutton." "Not really." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I know you didn't fold up and disappear when everyone else walked away. I know you stayed up 3 nights straight to keep a sick baby breathing. I know you've got more fight in you than most men I've met." Her throat tightened. "And Silas." He reached over, his hand closing gently over hers. "He's mine. You already know that." She looked down at their joined hands. "I haven't felt safe since before he was born. You are now." Tears rose, unbidden. She let them fall. Later, as the fire burned low and the night settled deeper, Sutton brought her a folded quilt and placed it gently over her shoulders. She didn't stop him when he sat beside her. She leaned into him, head resting against the solidness of his arm. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. And for the first time since she'd buried her husband, Rowena felt something she hadn't thought she'd feel again. Home. The days lengthened with the slow, stubborn thaw of late March. Snow lingered in the shaded cuts of the hills, but the creek behind the cabin ran faster now, and the ground near the barn turned soft underfoot. Sutton had begun cutting fence rails in the mornings, and Rowena spent the afternoons mending gear or boiling linen for the next season's store run. Silas, stronger by the week, gurgled and kicked from a blanket laid out by the hearth, his eyes following the movement of light across the ceiling beams. That morning, after feeding the hens, Rowena found Sutton working by the lean-to, oiling the worn leather of his saddle. He looked up as she approached, wiping his hands on a rag. "You ever been to the Cross Forks meet?" she asked, brushing hay from her skirt. "Once. Drove a team down for a man needed gear hauled." "Why?" "I heard from a woman at the mercantile it's coming up in 2 weeks. Folks bring livestock, seeds, sometimes trade for cloth. He nodded, straightening as he folded the rag. Big gathering. You thinking of going? I was, she said, then paused. There's a woman there sells cornmeal and dried pears. I thought I'd trade the quilt I finished. Sutton studied her a moment. You want me to come? Rowena folded her arms, not out of cold, but to still the flutter in her chest. I'd like that, but only if you want to. I'll ready the wagon, he said, voice quiet. She let herself smile, just a little. Then I'll start setting things aside. The morning of the meet, the sky held a faint haze but no sign of storm. Sutton hitched the team while Rowena dressed Silas in a thick wool cap and tucked him into a cedar-lined basket cushioned with folded undershirts. They rode east through the lower pass, the wagon wheels carving deep into the thawed ruts. Rowena kept one hand on the basket and the other on the edge of the seat, her eyes drawn to the slow green stirring along the valley floor. The Cross Forks meet had sprung up at the bend of 2 dirt tracks, where a dozen wagons circled and smoke from cook fires hung low over canvas tents. There were baskets of dried beans, jugs of rendered tallow, and barrels of pickled beetroot. A man with a fiddle played near the far end, his boot tapping time beside a girl twirling in worn calico. Rowena traded the quilt with a weathered woman who examined the stitching with respect. In return, she received a small sack of cornmeal, 2 lengths of homespun, and a paper twist of licorice root for Silas's gums. Sutton returned from the far side with a new scythe blade wrapped in burlap. You find what you needed? I did, she said, shifting the basket on her hip. Though I didn't expect a fair trade. You earned it. That quilt's strong work. They passed the midday near the fire pit, eating smoked trout on hard bread and sharing a mug of chicory. Silas dozed in the sling across Rowena's chest, his face turned inward, his breath warm against her collarbone. You ever miss town? Sutton asked, watching as a boy nearby led a lamb on a scrap of rope. Rowena followed his gaze. I missed the idea of it, but not the way it made me feel. What way was that? Like I owed thanks for every kindness, like it could all be taken back. Sutton was quiet. Then he said, This place takes your measure, doesn't let you pretend at things. She looked at him, the wind tugging loose strands of her hair. Do I measure up? He met her eyes. You do. That night, back at the cabin, Sutton brought in the last of the firewood while Rowena settled Silas into his cradle. The light from the stove flickered across the walls as she poured warm water into the basin. She turned as Sutton hung up his coat. You said once you came back from Kansas. Was that when your marriage ended? He nodded, then sat at the edge of the table, his hands clasped loosely. She left a note, said she needed more than quiet days and rough land. Rowena folded a cloth slowly. Did you love her? I thought I did. Maybe I loved the idea of not being alone. She took that in, setting the cloth down with care. And now, he watched her. Now I know what real looks like. She crossed the room, slow and certain. So do I. He rose then, and she stepped into his arms like she'd been waiting all winter for that moment. His hands were steady at her back, hers at his shoulder. Nothing rushed, nothing spoken, just the quiet truth of it, shared and solid. Later, they lay beneath the quilt she'd traded for pears, the baby sleeping sound beside them. The wind pressed at the windows, but the cabin held firm. Rowena turned toward him, her voice low. You think you'll ever want to marry again? He reached for her hand beneath the covers, threading his fingers through hers. I already do, if you'll have me. She didn't answer with words. She pressed her forehead to his and breathed in the scent of wood smoke and worn cotton. And in that space of silence, everything was said. Outside, the creek ran swift beneath the moonlight, and spring came just a little closer. The last hard frost came and went without fanfare. By late April, the hillside behind the cabin swelled with wild mustard and low purple phlox. Calves bawled across the southern ridge, and the air held the scent of damp pine and warmed earth. The cabin, once a place of shelter alone, had become something else, something that breathed with the rhythm of three. Sutton stood at the edge of the new pasture, testing the gate hinges he'd fashioned from iron scraps and old wagon pins. Rowena watched from the slope above, Silas nestled against her hip, a loop of cloth tying him close. He'd begun to reach for things his mother's braid, the corner of a quilt, the collar of Sutton's shirt when he was held. His grip was strong, his gaze steady. "You always this stubborn with your work?" she called down, adjusting the shawl across her shoulders. Sutton straightened, brushing sawdust from his sleeves. "Only when I want it to last." She made her way down the slope, boots sinking slightly in the soft soil. "I was thinking," she said once she reached him, "there's a plot of ground on the east side. Gets good morning light. Could put in vegetables. Maybe beans, squash." He nodded. "We'll need to fence it. Keep the deer from helping themselves. I can manage the planting if you'll haul the water. I've seen how you handle a hoe. You'll have it done before I get the first bucket up the hill." She raised a brow. "Is that praise or warning?" "Both." She laughed, and Silas stirred, stretching his arms with a sleepy sound. That evening, after the sun had dipped behind the ridge, Rowena stood at the table, rolling biscuit dough while Sutton mended a harness strap near the window. The oil lamp cast long shadows across the wooden walls. Silas lay on a folded quilt nearby, gurgling at the ceiling while kicking his feet against the fabric. Rowena glanced over her shoulder. "You ever think about building on to the cabin?" Sutton looked up, was considering it, thought maybe a second room. "Give you a space of your own." She turned back to the dough, kneading slow and even. "I don't want a room of my own." He rose, setting the harness aside. "No," she shook her head. "I want a room that's ours. For us. For him. One with a window that opens to the east so we can see the sun come up together." Sutton crossed the floor and wrapped his arms around her from behind. "Then I'll start drawing plans tomorrow." "You do that? For you? Every day I've got left." She leaned into him, eyes closing as the steady thump of his heart settled her. "I never thought peace could feel this quiet." "It's the good kind of quiet," he said. "The kind you build a life inside." 2 weeks later, they stood in the clearing beside the cabin, the scent of fresh cut pine thick in the air. Sutton had finished the foundation for the new room, the corner posts squared and set. Rowena laid the first board with her palms pressed flat against the grain, Silas watching from a sling across her back. "You ever think you'd be doing this again?" she asked. "No," he said, "but I'm glad I am." She turned to him. "Then let's not stop." He took her hand, fingers rough and warm around hers. "I don't plan to." They married that Sunday, under the cottonwood tree near the stream. No preacher, no audience. Just Sutton's hand in hers, Silas held between them, and the promise spoken soft beneath the leaves. "I will love you even when the land goes dry," she said. "And I'll hold you even when the snow comes early," he answered. They sealed it not with rings, but with the planting of a tree, a young aspen just east of the cabin, where the morning light would hit it first. Years passed as years do. The garden flourished, and so did they. Sutton built the addition himself, with Rowena smoothing the plaster and sewing curtains from the homespun she'd bargained for. Silas grew tall and sure-footed, his laugh echoing across the pasture as he chased chickens or followed Sutton with a wooden hammer in hand. By the time the boy was old enough to help with the branding, he called Sutton Pa without hesitation, and Sutton never once corrected him. Rowena kept a journal with neat lines and pressed flowers, records of rain, of harvests, of Silas's first steps and the night Sutton carved her name into the doorframe alongside his own. They never spoke of the people who had turned her away. It no longer mattered. What mattered was the family they had made, not the one they'd lost. One spring evening, years on, Rowena stood by the garden fence, watching the sky deepen into gold. Sutton came up beside her, still wearing his work apron, his hands stained from the new barn beams. Silas's voice carried from the slope, calling to the dog as he herded the goats back toward the pen. "Looks like he's found his place," Sutton said. Rowena slipped her arm through his. "Same as I did." They stood that way until the sun dipped low, the light catching on the bark of the aspen they'd planted together. It had grown tall, its leaves shivering gently in the breeze, roots deep in the soil they'd claimed as theirs. And beneath that tree, in the home they had built, Rowena and Sutton Vale lived out their years side by side, loved, known, and never alone again.